Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Barry, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind reintroducing yourself with your new title, the new venture you're with? It seems like you've joined most of the people that used to be in the education system and just said, this is not working for me. They're not doing it right.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this or not, Robbie. You can edit it out if I'm not, but it's more like fuck it. No, my wife and I have been thinking about this for a long time. We've reached the point in our lives where our kids are gone. So we're empty nesters now. And we decided this is the time to do it. So I quit my job. My wife quit her job. I bought a truck. We bought a fifth wheel, and we're going to hit the road. And the plan is to go to historical. I've been a history teacher for almost 30 years, teaching a lot of this out of books and from theoretical knowledge, just research on my own. And so the plan is to go to these different historical locations and teach on site through my website. I have a website, which I'll share that link with you, where I offer curriculum for U.S. history, world history, U.S. government, and also an elective offering, the JFK assassination. And I also offer online instruction. For the purposes of that online instruction, I will go to these sites and we'll videotape these locations, and I will teach the lessons from the actual site. For example, in October, we're going to go down to New Orleans. New Orleans is the hub of the entire JFK assassination plot. And we're going to set up camp along Magazine Street. And of course, you go in the middle of Magazine Street is where Oswald lived that summer of '63, that little shotgun rental house. About 3 or 4 blocks down is where Judith Very lived, right off of Magazine Street. They would catch the Magazine Street bus and go to their cover jobs down at Riley Coffee, which is at basically the terminus of Magazine Street downtown. So we'll go to the coffee building. And of course, if you know anything about what happened that summer, Oswald would slip out the back of the Riley Coffee building every morning and go about 2 or 3 blocks across to Lafayette Square and take up shop in the Newman building. And of course, the Newman building was the hub of all things Oswald in that summer of '63. From there, the Guy Bannister who ran that out of the back, he and David Ferry and Clay Shaw and Oswald worked on Operation Mongoose, running weapons and guns and ammo and money from Dallas through New Orleans down to Miami, the JM wave station down there. So he was prominently involved in that, but he was also being sheep-dipped at the same time by Guy Bannister, who was his handler. So he would walk over about 3 blocks to Canal Street, and he would publicly, in front of everybody, hand out pro-Castro leaflets. Sometimes he would stand on the corner at the International Trademark, which was owned by Clay Shaw. And of course, this is right downtown New Orleans, where all the hubbub, all the business activity was. And so we'll be visiting all those locations. And then sometimes he and Judith would sneak over to the French Quarter and eat dinner at the 500 Club, which is owned by Carlos Marcello. So we'll be over at the 500 Club. And then in the afternoon, when their shift would end, they get back on that Magazine Street bus and go back in the direction from which they came. And depending upon what day you're talking about, on some days of the week, they go to Louisiana Avenue and take up shop in 2 David Ferry houses. The one house housed, which they called the Mouse House, is where they housed all the mice for the big experiment they were working on. And the other house was where they actually did the experiments. Of course, Oswald's job was to run the materials back and forth. Judith did all the injections. And then he would, when it was time to take the materials to Dr. Mary Sherman at the infectious disease laboratory, he'd get on a bus or get a taxi and go across town to the infectious disease laboratory, which is right around the corner from Dr. Ochsner's famous clinic. Of course, Dr. Ochsner's running this whole thing, this whole project for the CIA. So we'll visit the Ochsner Clinic, the infectious disease laboratory. We were just down there about 2 months ago over the summer break. And in the infectious disease laboratory, that actual building that they worked out of is still there. And it's surrounded by these high security gates and everything. It's sort of dilapidated. And it's got all this electronic wiring running out of the back of the building, which of course was used to run that linear particle accelerator, and some ungodly amount of electric current that it needed. So, and then of course, Dr. Osner lives 2 blocks around the corner, right on the edge of Audubon Park. So we'll visit his house. It is amazing when you get down there how close, most of it within walking distance, all these locations are. Now, on the other days when they weren't running that medical experiment, he and Judith would take that Magazine Street bus all the way to the other end of town and stop at Audubon Park, and they would frolic in the park. They'd roll down Monkey Hill with the kids, which is sort of a local New Orleans tradition. They'd have picnics, they'd read books, and they'd act like lovebirds, basically. So there is a lot to see in New Orleans. And of course, we're going to be staying on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain. And that's significant because the north end of the lake is where all the anti-Castro Cuban Operation Mongoose training bases were. And it's at these bases where Lee Oswald, well, David Ferry was basically the guy in charge. He was doing all the training. But Lee Oswald went out there a couple times. In fact, there's a footage of some film of him during a rifle training session of him holding a rifle being trained by David Ferry alongside all the Cubans. And so we're going to be right there in the thick of all that. And then the interesting thing about New Orleans and why it's so important is because it was sort of the halfway point between Dallas and Miami. So everything that started in Dallas, money, weapons, guns, whatever, went through New Orleans where they added more materials and money. And then it eventually ended up in the hands of Alpha 66 at the JM Wave Station down in Miami. In fact, there's a very important witness in this whole case, Marita Lorenz, who is pictured and testified to this, that Lee Oswald came to one of their training camps on one of those runs down to Miami. And there's a picture with her. He appeared with Frank Fiorini, which is how she knew him. We know him as Frank Sturgis, and E. Howard Hunt. And those two are later famous for the Watergate break-in. But they were all together down there at one of the training stations down in Miami. So New Orleans is a very important, I would argue it's more important than Dallas. That's a very important location. And so now that I'm not tied to a job in a classroom at a public school somewhere, we're going to go down there and we're going to set up our fifth wheel. And we're going to take a month to go around to all these different locations that I just went through and teach lessons from each place and try to bring the assassination plot, which was hatched in New Orleans, alive, 61, 62, whatever years later. And then in November, we're going to hitch up the fifth wheel and go to Dallas. And that's the month of the anniversary. And they're having a big conference on November, that weekend of the 22nd. So we're going to do the same thing in Dallas, go to all the locations. And in the lead up to the conference, to the anniversary, then I'll go to the conference that weekend. And then
Shit, I might join you. I'm going to go down there for the 61st, so I might just go check out the spots with you.
yeah, well, we'll be there, and we're going to go to that I'm going to go to the conference. Trina doesn't want to go to the conference. She says she'll have enough of JFK she'll be preparing for Thanksgiving. So we'll be leaving town as soon as the conference is over and heading back to Tennessee to spend Thanksgiving that following week with our kids. So that's the plan. We're going to go and follow JFK's presidency. And we're going to start off, kind of where it started when he was running in the 60 primaries in West Virginia and how important West Virginia was to him being elected. And we'll go to Chicago and all the different places he gave significant speeches throughout. He's only president 1,000 days. So we're going to go and trace his route for 1,000 days and teach and compile a video library from each location. And I'll offer that on my website. Also, the video lessons or videos will be available on my Patreon channel, which I sent you the link for that as well. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to where the history happened. and we're going to try to make a living doing that instead of standing in a classroom trapped by four walls. So
You've obviously been on the show multiple times, so I'm not going to try and ask you the same old questions, but I do want to get into some of the New Orleans stuff that you just mentioned. But I also want to ask about how difficult was it for you as a teacher, now that you're free from the education bindings, to actually be able to teach a course? How limited were you to teaching courses on things like Richard Nixon, things like Watergate, things like the JFK subject, and kind of knowing that you can't really dive into the conspiratorial stuff that you'd like to do? Now, there are some universities that focus specifically on the JFK assassination, but most universities and most education systems do not really like the subject of conspiracy and things that aren't approved in the historical textbook.
They don't, it's worse than that, Robbie. We have standards we have to follow. And for example, there's 95 U.S. history standards, which starts in Reconstruction. So we pick up in 11th grade teaching Reconstruction. And the thought is that in 8th grade in social studies, the 8th grade teachers taught U.S. history from the Revolution, the colony days, to the Civil War. So we pick up at Reconstruction. And it follows to there's 95 standards. Guess how many standards deal with the JFK assassination?
Zero.
Zero. Not a single one. It's the most seminal event that happened and impacted our world, not just our country, during the Cold War and up to and including today. It is, you cannot understand, you cannot teach the Cold War with any sort of complete understanding without including a major chunk of that being the JFK assassination, all the factors that went into that.
And that's conspiracy stuff aside. That's with both sides, lone nuts and conspiracy people. The JFK assassination has a historical significance in just our history in general. So that whether you agree Oswald did it or not, it's just about learning as much as you can about it. There's so much information there.
Even if you don't want to get into how and why he died or how he died, or who you think did it, just talking about the after effects, the change in policy. I mean, it's like night and day. LBJ comes in and reverses everything JFK was doing. So we end up in a Vietnam War. 58,000 American men die as a result of that change in policy. That's kind of important. And, so going back to your question, if you teach Watergate, for example, you have to be careful because you get into what actually happened in Watergate and it leads you back to the JFK assassination. What they want is a cursory reading of the government narrative. That's all they want. And so a typical, a state test, which determines what kind of a quality of education a kid got, a state test will ask a question about Watergate saying something to the effect, on this such and such a day, what happened at the DNC headquarters in Washington? Or they'll have a multiple choice option. You'll have to choose the option that 5 burglars broke in and they had evidence on them from the White House. So this was a White House break-in. And Richard Nixon was impeached or was going to be impeached for trying to cover up his role in Watergate. And that's the surfacey knowledge. Names, dates, an event here or two, but nothing with regard to the JFK assassination. And so you're getting a very incomplete. This is why I call my website and my class offerings Standards Plus History Academy. I'll give you the basic standards. If you hire me to teach your child U.S. history standards, I'll give them the basics. But I go way beyond that, and I teach the stuff that you're not allowed to teach or you don't have time to teach. But for a matter of practical purposes, the schedule is so condensed, Robbie, to get those 95 standards taught, you really don't have time to delve into the important stuff, to delve into the stuff that makes history interesting. You just marking off, checking boxes, trying to get through all the material because the test is in April. So you really don't have a full 10 months of school. The last month and a half, you've already taken the test. And when you're done with the test, you're done with the class, essentially. So you have to cram all those 95 standards and all that material starting in August. And in between, you have a week off for fall break. You have 2 weeks off. You have a week off for Thanksgiving. That's 2 weeks total. Then you have 2 more weeks off for Christmas. That's 4 weeks. And then you have a week off for spring break. That's 5 weeks. So you don't even have 8.5 months, you have 7.5 months to get all that material in. So you're just flying, and it's like an airplane flying at 20,000 feet. That's the kind of knowledge or exposure you're getting to history. It's a surface now, and I don't blame the teachers. It's just the way the calendar works, and you're in such a time crunch during that period. But the standards should include, we have some standards that shouldn't be in there, but for political reasons they are. And then we have some standards that should be there that aren't there, like the JFK assassination. And, it's interesting. From a political perspective, Watergate is the favored scandal. So you have all kinds of standards talking about Watergate because, I don't think it's a big secret that the ideology that makes its way into most curriculums and textbooks is left-leaning. And the culprit in the Watergate scandal, according to the government narrative, is Richard Nixon, a Republican. So, boy, they major on that scandal. But nobody wants to talk about the JFK assassination.
Which is surprising because Richard, I had to do a clip on this, and I mean, you can go check it up if you just look up President JFK, people's remarks on his death. A lot of people made remarks on Kennedy's death. Certain senators, certain people really had an emotional connection with him. And this will get into witnesses and witness deaths later, but Grant Stockdale was obviously really torn up about it. I think he died December 8th. He fell out of a 13-story building. Because you could say it was because of the Bobby Baker scandal, because allegedly some of his funds were involved in that, or you could say it was he met RFK on the 26th of November and came back speaking to his lawyer, talking about that somebody was in on the assassination. So whether he was just depressed and decided to do that, I have no clue. But the person that made a remark to President Kennedy that never mentioned President Kennedy by name is Eisenhower. Eisenhower went for 5 minutes explaining that the death of a president, just examine that, the death of a president, a person in office, the American people should rally behind their government because this is the time they need them more than ever. He did not once mention President Kennedy. He mentioned his wife, Mrs. Kennedy, but then he goes into explaining other political assassination attempts, such as Abraham Lincoln, such as Roosevelt. Then he goes to attempts on Truman's life. And he explains all them specifically by name, but never mentions Kennedy. But then you examine Nixon. Nixon mentioned Kennedy by name. He apologized to it. Now, he is very weird in his speaking. I think we've all kind of seen that with some things. But it's kind of awkward when you watch him talk about it. But I think a lot of people need to change their perspective a little bit more on Nixon, at least when it comes to importance of other events. And whether you consider him behind the assassination or not, I know some people believe that. I think you came on here and explained some good reasoning for that. But there is a lot of people, obviously, that kind of glossed over JFK, whether it was because he was young or whether it was because, I don't know, they just didn't accept him for what he was doing. So a lot of his political office has now been theorized as, could this have happened if JFK would have been alive? And that's why this event is important. Would we have still been in Vietnam? That big question.
One of the tricks that I've learned, and it's relevant to today because I just saw it in the news yesterday, and this is regarding the assassination attempt on Trump. And there's a Senate, actually, he's a representative, Clay Higgins, is conducting his own investigation. And he is determined in a preliminary report that the FBI and the Secret Service and all the feds that are involved in this investigation are purposely trying to obfuscate and keep the all of the conclusions about what happened on July 13th, just this past year, sort of vague and sort of fuzzy. They don't want a determination. They don't want a firm conclusion. They don't want anything that is conclusive. They want to fuzzy everything up, and he's trying to pierce through that veil. And he's finding it difficult because the feds are the ones fighting him. You would think the feds would want to get to the bottom of it. They're the ones fighting him. Well, there's a lot of similarities to that and what happened with JFK. And I think the common theme there is, it's okay to talk about Watergate because the narrative became hardened in the minds of the American people, which was that a singular person Richard Nixon was the culprit. And as long as people buy that and believe that, it's okay to talk about it because you're not including in that list of culprits the government. You're not including in that larger institutions, which they'll go to the mattresses to protect. But in the JFK assassination, it's different because any close examination of the JFK assassination points back to either the government itself or to institutions or agencies within the government. For example, the CIA, for example, the FBI, for example, the Secret Service, for example, a future president, LBJ. I mean, you can't get away from it. And so they've purposely tried to keep the JFK assassination, all things related to it, very fuzzy, very vague. And they'll even drip information out in these these little releases that actually give some credence to some of the conspiracy theories because they actually are in favor of all of these conspiracy theories because it fragments the population. You get this group of people that believes in this conspiracy theory, you get this group of people that believes in that conspiracy theory, you get this group of people that believes in another conspiracy theory, and there is no general consensus. It's murky. And people, they get their feelings hurt if you argue against their favored conspiracy theory. So it keeps everybody guessing, and everybody's like a cat chasing their tail. But and they're trying to do the same thing with what happened this year with Trump. So I look at the overall trends and I say, whenever I see that murkiness, whenever I see the government fighting against a legitimate investigation, it's because they're involved and they don't want anybody to know that they're involved. And they're trying to preserve that people's faith and confidence in the institution, the agencies, and the government itself. Meanwhile, they're all for close examination and impeachment of an individual because you can hang Nixon out to dry and nobody else gets hurt. Nixon bears the shame the rest of his life. But the government and all the agencies and the entities within the government that were actually involved walk away unscathed every time, every single time. So I see clearly why the textbooks deal with Watergate, but they won't deal with JFK. It's the same reason why today Google search won't, if you get on it, you can't find hardly anything about the Trump assassination attempt. They're doing the same thing in real time today that they've done for 60 years with JFK. They just have better technology and they can do it quicker. And 60 years ago, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have all the search opportunities that we have today. And so it's been through, it's been through textbooks and research books and books that independent researchers have written, and they've come back with their versions and their books and their authors, and it's been this back and forth, who did what, is it the lone gunman theory? Is it a conspiracy theory? Which conspiracy theory? There's 10 of them, there's 20 of them, there's 50 of them, and it keeps everything murky. Meanwhile, Watergate, you ask 90% of the population, you ask who was responsible for Watergate, and they'll all say, oh, that's Richard Nixon. And, it really didn't have much to do, I don't think, with left or right, even though I kind of insinuated that earlier. It has more to do with protecting the government. And Nixon, you can hang out as a singular individual to dry. If you get into the JFK assassination, or if you get into what happened July 13th, you're going to go back to the government. They don't want you to get into that. They don't want that topic examined. They use these same methods over and over and over again. And so they classify all of the materials. Some independent researchers have a very difficult time unwinding what actually happened.
Let's try and stay away from the more modern day stuff because I don't know how much safe it is for YouTube when it comes to the Trump stuff. You can't really talk about even Jan 6. But when you boil it back to that line that you just said. I'm more in belief that these agencies have had a lot of issues with them, and what they're doing, and a lot of the times they can come off very conspiratorial, is that they're protecting their credibility in the eyes of the American people. And let's take an examination for the Secret Service. Look at JFK's Secret Service. Ralph Yarborough lit him up in a report when it first happened. The very first day it was the day of, or 2 days later on the 25th. He's sitting there giving a statement talking about, one thing that I did observe was the slow reaction time of the Secret Service and JFK's motorcade. Seems like they were very delayed in their response. That's Ralph Yarborough. I was the senator who was riding, what, 2 cars behind JFK, or 1 car behind JFK. He was not the follow-up car, but the one behind that with President Lyndon Johnson, the one who smelled smoke when they were going under the overpass. But then you examine the 9 out of 18 Secret Service agents that were out drinking till like 3 or 4 a.m. at the cellar and other things like that. I mean, why did they destroy documentation 2 weeks after Judge Thunheim of the AARB requested it? Well, they're protecting their reputations, because obviously the Secret Service, I mean, relating it to today, they obviously haven't changed much when it comes to their reactions on being able to stop a security threat. But it's also, you have Jesse Curry that makes a statement saying that the FBI usually alerts them when someone with this type of background is in the area, so they can make sure they get coverage, or they're just aware that there could be a threat to the president's life. And that's what called Hoover and the DeLoach memo to get pissed off at Jesse Curry and tell him that you need to say that those were false, that your statements were false, then you need to recant them, or there's going to be consequences.
Well, I got that was a seminal moment for me. I had completely I've been studying this since 1997, so however many years that is. And I
26.
had 26 years. I had completely just, I don't know. I just it didn't connect with me that the Secret Service might have any role to play in what happened in Dallas. I don't know. You grow up and you think the Secret Service, their job is to protect the president. If something happens, sometimes stuff happens, and they probably did their best to protect him, and it just didn't work out that day. It was a bad day. It was a bad day. I was kind of one of those guys. I always gave them the benefit of the doubt. And then I was listening one day, and then I bought his book, and I read his book, L. Fletcher Prouty, and he was talking about the secret team, and he got into the Petorian Guard, which is what he calls it, and he went in a direction I had never even thought of before, and that is how the Petorian Guard, which came of age, and that term comes from ancient Rome.
It's in Star Wars.
Is it?
Yeah.
And their job was to protect the emperor, or these dignitaries.
They're the red guys and that protect the Sith Lord, the main dude.
Okay. I don't know anything about Star Wars, so you're talking Greek to me. But anyway, you get the point. That's their job. And of course, we all know what happened to Julius Caesar, and how the Praetorian Guard stepped aside and stripped away the security, which left him vulnerable to the senators who came up and killed him. Of course, that assassination plot, he uses that as a template. And it really opened my eyes to how these assassinations can happen, because his point, he had several points. One of his point was, it can't happen if the Praetorian Guard does its job. It just can't happen. If the Praetorian Guard does its job, nobody can get close to that person, to that dignitary. Now, if they strip away the security, and there's lots of ways that they can do that, or they don't do their job, or there's a conspiracy within, then the person is vulnerable. And it doesn't matter who the culprits in Rome's case, or in Julius Caesar's case, the folks that killed him were his so-called friends. You remember the expression "et tu, Brutus"? It was Brutus. And these are these senators. These are honorable men who killed him, and the Praetorian Guard let it happen. And he said, if you think about the JFK assassination through that lens, and then you go and you study what happened in the lead up to that assassination, it is clear that there was a conspiracy that began with the Secret Service. Because all the other conspirators that came along later and did their part, they can't do their part if the Secret Service doesn't first do its part. And so, that's where this expression comes along, security stripping. security stripping. That's how the Secret Service participates in these things. You look at in the lead up to November 22nd, 1963, and how all of the major White House detail agents were replaced. I mean, starting with Gerald Benn, who was the head of that Secret Service detail. He was replaced by Roy Kellerman. Well, what part did Roy Kellerman play in the assassination? He was the guy in the passenger seat of the limo that was supposed to jump over the seat after the first shot, get on top of Kennedy and protect him from future shots. If he had done his job, Kennedy would have lived. He got hit, but it wasn't a lethal shot, that first shot. He never moved. He never moved. Floyd Boring was he was in charge of all the advance arrangements for Dallas. That was he was told to go on vacation. He said, I've never been on vacation. What am I supposed to do on vacation? 30 years in a career, I've never been on vacation. They asked him later, what'd you do on your vacation? I mowed my grass. I didn't know what to do on vacation. He'd never taken a vacation. He was informed that he was taking a vacation for the Dallas trip. And he was replaced by William Greer. Well, what does William Greer do? He's the driver who's supposed to hit the gas after the first shot. There was a period of time from the first shot to the last shot.
Are you sure it's not Lawson that he was replaced with? Because Lawson's the one that covered the advanced routes he's the one that put the motorcycle cops behind JFK, behind the rear tires where they weren't instructed to go forward.
Floyd Boring was replaced by William Greer. William Greer is the guy who actually drove the limo. Now you'll see here in a minute when I get into the Thomas Shipman stuff.
The guy who died earlier, like a month or so before.
He's the regular driver. So Floyd Boring wasn't a driver. He was in charge of advance arrangements. But in his place, they sent William Greer because they needed a driver when they got rid of Thomas Shipman. But I'll get to that in a second. So William Greer is supposed to hit the gas, instead hits the brakes. Even Jackie, you talk about Ralph Yarborough, he said the same thing. But Jackie said, I don't know what was wrong with that Secret Service driver. If he just hit the gas, my husband would be alive. But he didn't.
Well, Greer looked back twice. A lot of people don't know that if you watch the film, and then he's at Parkland Hospital, and this is in statements from other Secret Service agents that he's apologizing to Jackie. He's like, I should have been able to do something.
Yeah, he should have. You brought up mentioned Thomas Shipman. He was the regular driver. He'd been the driver for Kennedy and for others. And then on October 14th, 1963, he dies suspiciously. There's no toxicology test. There's no autopsy. There's actually no news coverage. It's a total blackout. He died at Camp David. And his family, when they, who's the guy that does all the
Vince
secrets?
Palomara.
Vince Palomara contacted his family, and his family was very suspicious. He had just passed his annual comprehensive physical exam. He had no history in this family or himself of any heart troubles. He had relatives in Dallas, so he's looking forward to going to Dallas. And he had several times told family members, according to Vince Palomara, that if anything ever happened while he was the driver, he would pull out of line and get the heck out of Dodge, basically. In that moment, after he died, his family was pressured into a quick burial. And as I said, there was no autopsy. And this was accomplished through Admiral George Berkeley, who turned out to be JFK's personal doctor, also later LBJ's personal doctor. So you look at the scenarios there. Why would Shipman have to be replaced by Greer? Shipman either had no foreknowledge of the Dallas plan. That's one scenario. And they had to get him out of the way because they knew he was an honest cop. He was a straight guy. If something happens, he had already said he'd get out of line and get out of Dodge. So if he had no foreknowledge of the Dallas plan, they got to get him out of the way. They can't let him be the driver because he'll mess everything up. If the first shot doesn't kill Kennedy, they won't get a second shot if Shipman's driving. The other scenario is that Shipman did have foreknowledge of the Dallas plan, but refused to play along. Okay. That's probably the scenario, because now that he knows he's been let in on the secret and they realize that he's not going to play along, you can't let him live. He's a witness. The other scenario is he's a dirty cop. If he's a dirty cop, you don't have to get rid of him. So the only one of those three scenarios that makes any sense is that Shipman had foreknowledge of the Dallas plan, but refused to play along. And the reason I believe that is the scenario is because there's another Secret Service officer who did have foreknowledge of the plan and did live to, to the day of Dallas to try to do something about it. And nobody knows that guy's name. So it's not just Shipman who was aware. But see, security stripping, they got rid of Floyd Boring, they got rid of Gerald Benn, they got rid of Thomas Shipman. And in addition to that, 11 of the most inexperienced members of the White House detail were transferred out within 60 days of the assassination and replaced by less experienced agents. So you have it's like a plum job to get on the White House detail. You got to work your way up to that.
But are we overestimating their capabilities, though? Because have you ever read SS Youngblood's statements or the statement of Herschel Jacks, the driver of LBJ's car? He says some stuff like, obviously, I think a lot of people say if you look at the footage, you can't see Youngblood on top of LBJ or Lady Bird, but that's apparently what he did. But Herschel Jacks, the driver, said that after the shots rang off and he went under the overpass, Youngblood was getting in the back seat asking what that first shot was or what that sound was because he thought it was like a firecracker or something. And then once he started to figure out that it was a shot while they're going, and I think there's a photo of it as they go over the underpass, they have the motorcycles up front, and it's like you can see the overpass behind him, Dealey Plaza's behind him. Around that time, he asked him, he goes, "How far till we get to the Trademark?" Youngblood says that while he's allegedly on top of LBJ, and Herschel Jacks like, "We're not going to the Trademark. We're going to Parkland Hospital. The president was just shot." And and then I forgot what he said. He said something like, "How long till we get there?" or something like that. And then it became very, very weird because he immediately goes into protecting LBJ and getting LBJ inside the hospital. But no statements otherwise as to if JFK is okay or anything like that. He was just main focus was LBJ. But why would you ask if we're going to the Trademark still after the shots just rang out? That doesn't make sense. Where I start going, maybe we're just overestimating the Secret Service intelligence.
Or their competence.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we already know that most of them, and it probably includes Youngblood, were out all night the night before.
Yeah,
drinking.
from Abraham Bolden's account, a lot of them are alcoholics. So this is apparently, and I think it's even in Rowley's testimony with Earl Warren, that this isn't new for the Secret Service.
Yeah. Bolden paints a terrible picture of the Secret Service. They had left firemen to protect the president on different occasions while they in the hotels while they went out and partied. Local firemen to protect the president. And of course, they'd been out drinking the night before. And now, in their defense, a guy like Youngblood, I don't believe all of the agents were complicit in this. You don't have to have them all complicit. They just follow orders, right? You just have to have a few strategic people placed at the top that give the orders, and all the agents just follow the orders. So this isn't an argument for or against Youngblood. He only knew what he was supposed to know, which was, I'm responsible for LBJ's protection. And just like the one agent who got off the halfback, the car right in back of the limo, he wasn't running to protect the president. He was running to protect Jackie because, Clint Hill, that wasn't his assignment to protect the president. His assignment was to protect Jackie. So they're zeroed in on who their protectee is and what the itinerary is. So Youngblood, in a moment of crisis, people do this. I've heard psychologists talk about this. In a stressful situation or some kind of trauma, you don't think clearly anyway. Now, you would hope that Secret Service agents would, but in a moment like that, you're just falling back on either your training or the itinerary, which you've been trained in, what's going to happen next. What was supposed to happen next they're supposed to end up at the Trademark. And they've had this shooting. Of course, he's several cars back. And so you have to at least assume that he doesn't know the president's been hit.
Well, it's a theory of Joe Green, but I think it goes to what you're saying, which isn't being out drunk and being hungover the next day or the same day, depending on when you left the cellar, isn't that technically plausible deniability? You're not at your full capabilities. They would know that. But at the same time, you also aren't, you're just kind of there responding to things that are happening, not being advanced thinking or trying to have foreknowledge of
Yeah, well,
something.
you put those two things together, and I think there's some credence in that. Put those two things together. You're out all night. You just take a guy like me. I've never drank in my life. I've never tasted alcohol. So if I
You're
did
missing out, my friend.
I would be a terrible drunk because it wouldn't take very much to make me lose. I'd be out because I've never had any. So, but for me, if I was out all night, I go to bed at 9 o'clock. If I was out all night, I would be useless the next day. And that's just from lack of sleep. Now, add to that all the alcohol and whatever else they were consuming. These guys are completely wasted. And if you have a Secret Service culture that permits that, and according to Abraham Bolden, this had been going on for a while, then you are sort of unofficially blessing that kind of behavior, sanctioning that kind of behavior. And you aren't, if you're involved in a plot to kill the president on November 22nd, you're not altogether unhappy that your agents are out all night the night before. And any encouragement or whatever that you can offer them in that way, it just helps because, like you say, later, when everyone's pointing the fingers at your agency, you can say, you can hang out to dry individual Secret Service agents who acted unprofessionally and were derelict in their duty because of that. Instead of the Secret Service being culpable, it's these individual agents, the underlings, and the guys who were involved in the conspiracy walk away scot-free again because it wasn't them. It was their underlings. And so then it becomes a matter of internal discipline, right? And yeah, it does. It is I kind of agree with that theory. It gives, I don't have any proof of it, but the fact that Abraham Bolden said that this had been going on for a long time speaks to a culture that this has been going on. And, we already know because of Bolden's testimony and because of others that these agents and the Secret Service in general hated JFK. They hated him. A lot of it had to do with his civil rights positions
And his affairs.
And his affairs. And they knew about his drug use. And they thought he was a threat to national security. And he was loose morally. They thought he was just, in so many different ways, they disagreed with him being in that office. And so it wouldn't be a stretch, especially when the guy in charge is best friends with LBJ. It wouldn't be a big stretch to talk to him and encourage some security stripping in advance of the November 22nd motorcade so that there are other conspirators, which the Secret Service doesn't have to know about. All you have to do is strip your security. And if you want to create a plausible deniability situation the night before, fine. But you've got to strip your security in such a way so that the president is vulnerable, so that your driver doesn't do what he's supposed to do, so that the guy in the passenger seat doesn't do what he's supposed to do, so that we end up at a Trademark. So in case we don't get him at Love Field or we don't get him at Dealey Plaza, we can get him at the Trademark. So you got to have your people argue to the White House people that the Trademark is actually the better location for the speech, not the Women's Museum. The White House wanted to go to the Women's Museum because it only had two entrances and exits. It had a garage door. You could drive the limo right into the building and shut the door behind you. It was about as secure a building as you could get. It was defendable. The Trademark was not defendable. It had catwalks all over it that looked down over the arena where the president would be speaking. And the catwalks, there was a second floor catwalk. There was a third floor catwalk. You could easily have a sniper on one of those catwalks. And so that was the plan. If we don't get him at Love, we'll get him at Dealey. If we don't get him at Love or Dealey, we'll get him at the Trademark. And it was the Secret Service in conjunction with Governor John Connally that argued for the Trademark. And that building had 42 entrances and exits. That's going to be a lot harder to secure that building with the catwalks and all the entrances. There's no garage door entry. It's not defendable. So when the Secret Service is arguing for the Trademark, nobody knows it at the time. But that's to set up what's to come. They're stripping the security away. And so, yeah, another guy that was really key in this whole thing with regards to Secret Service is Emory Roberts. Emory Roberts is ever present with the president that day. You see him when the president is leaving that morning. Emory Roberts is right behind him. When the president is getting off the plane at Love Field, Emory Roberts is right next to him. Emory Roberts is everywhere. And he becomes the Secret Service agent in charge of the Dallas motorcade. Okay. He's not over the whole advance arrangements. He's not over the whole Dallas trip. He's over the motorcade in particular. Well, think about the motorcade. And, starting at Love Field, when it was Emory Roberts who waved off Don Lawton and Hank Ripka, the two agents that are supposed to be on the rear of the limo, riding on the running boards. They would have been in the way. If there was a shot from behind and above, you would assume that one of those, Lawton or Ripka, would be in the way of that shot. But they got rid of him. Emory Roberts waved him off. There's a famous picture of Lawton with his hands out saying, "What? Why are you waving me off? This is my station. This is my job." They had to go downtown Dallas to a coffee shop and wait for the motorcade to be over for their next assignment. They didn't know what to do. The motorcade just left them standing there at Love Field. So there's an example where Emory Roberts, in his job, being in charge of the motorcade, got rid of two of the security officers who would normally be there. Another thing that he did is he got rid of Godfrey McHugh. Godfrey McHugh, if you go back and look at all the JFK motorcades, Godfrey McHugh was an Air Force military aide. He always sat in the front seat in the middle between the two Secret Service agents. You can see him in Ireland. It wasn't that long ago that JFK went to Ireland. They had this motorcade weaving through Dublin. And there's Godfrey McHugh sitting smack dab in the middle of the front seat. Well, they need that opening. So Emory Roberts says, "Godfrey, you're not in the front car. You're not in the limo. You're going to be sitting back in the 5 cars back." So they removed it. Well, where did they find a bullet hole in the limo windshield? Right smack in the middle of that windshield where Godfrey McHugh was sitting. So it was Emory Roberts who moved him to the back of the motorcade. McHugh protested. He said, "Wait, I'm not supposed, I always sit here." And Emory Roberts says, "Not today, you're not." Then they removed the flatbed media truck. There was always a flatbed media truck that rode in front of the limo, and all the media members would be standing on that flatbed, taking their pictures, etc. They put that in the back. So they have now removed, Emory Roberts, who's in charge of the motorcade, has now removed anybody who's in the front who might be an obstacle to a front shot. The flatbed media truck is gone. Godfrey McHugh is gone. And then 8 of the motorcycles. They always had, all the motorcades had 12 motorcycles. Not in Dallas. They only had 4 on the motorcade. That's Emory Roberts. They put them to the rear and to the sides, to the flanks of the limo, so that if there's a shot from the side, he's now open. There's a line of fire. There's a line of fire from the front. Normally those motorcycles would encircle the limo, and it would have made a front shot or a side shot impossible. But way out in front of the sheriff's car, they weren't protecting the limo. And normally, like I said, they have 12, but there was only 4, and that line of sight or that line of fire was wide open. And then going back to Emory Roberts, we all know that he was involved along with Earl Cabell, the mayor, in changing the motorcade route. The motorcade route was supposed to go straight on Main. It was never supposed to turn on Houston and Elm. And that's how it was published in the paper. And at the last minute, Emory Roberts, Earl Cabell, the mayor, change it to include 2 90-degree turns, slowing the limo down to about 10 or 11 miles per hour. And it's like, if you can't bring the shooters to the target, you bring the target to the shooters. And they've got the shooters stationed in the Daltex building in the county court building. They've got them in the Texas School Book Depository, the grassy knoll, maybe the triple underpass. They got the shooters stationed in a triangulated hit, but they need to reroute that motorcade. Well, Emory Roberts, and it was a complete violation of protocols. You're never supposed to have one turn, let alone two. So, you look at the role that Emory Roberts played in the security stripping, and you now have a president who's weaving his way through Dallas, not realizing he's being led like a lamb to the slaughter, right? And he has no one to protect his front or his side. And that's what we call security stripping. And Emory Roberts was involved in all of that. And then we get into, there's other examples as well, but I'll let you pick up there if you want to.
Yeah, I don't want to focus too much on the Secret Service. I think we've given enough examples on them, but I do want to go right into the FBI, the intelligence failures when we're looking at the FBI. Obviously, there's a large amount of people that were in Dealey Plaza, and we have a certain amount of statements from certain witnesses. The FBI did not do a thorough investigation, at least in my eyes, of witness statements and the importance of eyewitness testimony. So I'm going to ask you about your thoughts on eyewitness and your witness testimonies. Then I'm going to ask you your thoughts on the FBI.
Okay. Well,
do you want me to repeat it?
No, I'm just curious what.
Do you trust eyewitness testimony? I mean, you got to in a case where you're suspecting the government of being culpable of. Look, there's some evidence for the assassination, very minuscule in my opinion, but there's evidence of the cover-up. There are things these intelligence agencies and things that were going on that do not fit an investigation into the president's death, mostly eliminate the possibility of a getaway driver within 48 hours. A memo was passed. Oswald did it. That's how the FBI reports read. It's why every last question on an FBI report states, "Did you know Lee Harvey Oswald?" Every single one. There's not one that the interview that they did that doesn't end with that as a last question. Where did you hear the shots come from? Oh, I saw smoke by the picket line near the grass embankment. Well, that would be called the grassy knoll, but what did the FBI report say? Oh, so west of the Texas School Book Depository, you recalled seeing smoke? It's like, why would you even, that's not even more accurate. That's just like way off to right field or left field.
Yeah. Well, there was an interesting interaction. I think it was James Hosty, who was the FBI agent who was, he was stationed to Dallas and he was supposed to be keeping eyes on Lee Harvey Oswald.
He was watching Marina.
Yeah. And according to a local, in the time right after you mentioned the FBI coming out and initially stating that it was a lone gunman, and they pretty much stayed with that conclusion throughout. And J. Edgar Hoover, he announced it to LBJ that it was a lone gunman, and they hadn't even begun the investigation yet, but they've already concluded that it was a lone gunman. And there was a famous memo that Hoover wrote stating such, and then Katzenbuck, the number 2 at the Justice Department behind the Assistant Attorney General, he wrote a memo and he said, the public must be convinced that Oswald acted alone. He didn't have any Confederates. And if there had been a trial, he would have been convicted at trial. And, that became the narrative. And J. Edgar Hoover, who everybody knows is in cahoots with LBJ, that's his neighbor in Washington. They're very tight, and was always fighting for his job. JFK was always trying to get rid of him. He had to resort to all kinds of blackmail to keep his job when Kennedy's were in power. Well, as soon as LBJ becomes president, he appoints J. Edgar Hoover director for life and never has to fight for his job anymore. And so it's pretty apparent when you start to go back that the FBI was in cahoots with the government narrative, and that's their job. And of course, they fed all the evidence to the Warren Commission. So the Warren Commission didn't study anything that didn't get filtered through first, J. Edgar Hoover. And then it had that filter, and then it had another filter, and his name was Alan Dulles. So the Warren Commission, I among them have been very critical of the Warren Commission. Well, that it's really hard to come to a good conclusion when the evidence that you're studying is being slanted in such a way as to support the government narrative, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. So that's all the evidence they got. Anything else that might have hinted at impropriety by the CIA or the Secret Service or even the FBI, that got set to the side. And J. Edgar Hoover's job was to filter all that evidence, and he did a very good job of it. So I could, back to that James Hosty thing, when they were in that parking garage, he runs into that Dallas police officer. I'm trying to remember that guy's name. He was the guy that came up with there was all these questions about how in 14 minutes did the Dallas police come up with the suspect's name. It only took them 14 minutes. And, there was a Dallas cop, and his name was Jack Revel. He was the head of Dallas Police Intelligence, and he was given an assignment to go into the Texas School Book Deposit. This is like seconds or minutes after the assassination, and do a roll call with all the employees there and cross-check it with a roster from HR, from the Texas School Book Depository. And the theory was, whoever your assassin was in this building, they won't be here. The employees are all supposed to still be here, but whoever the assassin was, he probably won't be here. Now, we found out later that a lot of others had left as well because the superintendent, Roy Truly, had told everybody to go home. Work's done for the day.
See, I got in an argument with the Lone Nutter about this because he was like, all right, name somebody that left the school book depository and didn't or wasn't on the roll call. I go, wait, hold on. Like, you mean employees? Like, because there's people that work in a publishing company a couple floors above. So when I named a couple names, they're like, no, someone that was in there at the time of the shooting. I was like, look, if they left 10 minutes before the motorcade, they're still going to be on the fucking roll call. Like, it's going to happen. What is it? Oh God, I think it's Sue Larson, or Sandra Larson. She's on there. She's right in front of the Stemmen sign, a little sign right when Kennedy's turning down the street about to get shot. That's filmed by Abraham Zapruder. She left at 12:20 and never returned back to the building. She went home. Then you got Ruth Dean, who went to the bank afterwards because she was like, I don't see the point in going back in there after my lunch. I'm just going to go to the bank, and then never returned to the building. And then one woman, oh God, I don't know if it's Betty Dragu or if it's Betty Foster, but she couldn't return to the building because it was locked. And she had to wait outside till almost around 3 o'clock when someone finally gave her jacket.
Yeah, well, that lieutenant, you were talking about names. He had a list of names. I'm looking at a list. There's probably about 20 names on there. So, yeah, there's quite a few. Now, that doesn't mean they're all suspects. His job wasn't to determine who the suspect was. His job was just to cross-check who was actually there and who was supposed to be there. So he goes back and draws up this list. And when he gets in his car to head back to police headquarters, a man jumps in the car with him in the passenger seat. And this guy was a ONI officer, Office of Naval Intelligence. We found out about this later. And he rides with him, and they get back, and he produces this list of names. And right at the top of the list is Harvey Lee Oswald at 605 Elsbeth. That's the top name. It's not, the list is not alphabetical. He's just writing down names. And the very top name is Harvey Lee Oswald at 605 Elsbeth. Well, he obviously didn't get that name from HR, even though he got all the other names and addresses from HR, but because Oswald had not lived at 605 Elsbeth for a year. And he'd only worked at the Texas School Book Depository for 6 weeks at that point, give or take. So it's a wrong address. His name is not Harvey Lee Oswald, it's Lee Harvey Oswald. And so years later, during the House Select Committee hearings, this is 1978, so you're talking 15 years later, that became a point of contention. Where did Dallas police get this name that was misapplied and that address, which was wrong? How did they get this name so quick, 14 minutes? And so They call in a guy named Colonel Robert Jones. Colonel Robert Jones was from the 4th Army Intelligence at Fort Sam Houston. And he's testifying to the House Select Committee in 78. This is right in their records and their documents, that he had heard from his people in Dallas that Dallas police were looking for or had arrested a man identified as Alec James Heidel in the minutes right after the assassination. And he goes to his intelligence files and he looks for a Heidel. He finds a file and it cross-references to a Harvey Lee Oswald of 605 Elsbeth. So Robert Jones testified that he got on the phone and called his ONI buddy who was sitting in the car with Lieutenant Jack Rebel, and he tells him, the guy you're looking for is Harvey Lee Oswald of 605 Elsbeth. And so ONI officer gives that information to Lieutenant Jack Rebel, who puts it at the top of his list. In other words, Dallas police did not get that name from the HR report that they got from Texas School Book Depository. They didn't get that name from their own investigative work. That name was seeded into the case 14 minutes after the shooting by military intelligence, who their records showed Oswald working or living at 605 Elsbeth because their records were a year old. Robert Jones testified to that. So right off the bat, we know that the Dallas police did not come up with this name on their own. This was seeded by military intelligence. Of course, everybody knows Oswald was in the Marines. ONI is the Navy. Of course, the Marines are in the Navy, and he was, they say once ONI, always ONI. And, you know, it was during his time in the Marines, he was recruited into the CIA. So military intelligence has this information, and they gave it to Dallas police for a reason. It's interesting. At the time that he testified that he was doing all this behind the scenes, Lee Harvey Oswald hadn't even been identified yet, hadn't been arrested yet. None of the rumors that he was hearing were even true. And no one knew who Alec James Heidel was. So military intelligence knew all that, and they seeded that name into the Dallas police. Now, I brought up Lieutenant Jack Revel's name for a reason, because later he's in the parking garage. This is several hours after Oswald has been arrested. And he's just walking to his car, and he bumps into James Hosty, the FBI guy. We're back to the FBI now. And Hosty tells him, and this is a loose translation, but he says basically, hey, a communist shot the president. And Jack Revel says, what? And he says, a communist shot the president. We knew about him. We knew he was a communist. We knew he was a threat. We knew he was here. Lee Harvey Oswald. He's telling Jack Revel this, and Jack Revel says, who is Lee Harvey Oswald? This is the same guy who just produced a list 14 minutes after the shooting and put Harvey Lee Oswald at the top of the list. This is probably the best proof that Jack Revel had no idea who this guy was. Because 2 hours later, when he's confronted with that same name, he doesn't even remember the name.
Or he just realizes that he might have spelled it wrong, and that's what the whole thing is.
Perhaps. But I think according to Robert Jones's testimony, he's the one that seeded that name in. So, it's kind of like my students. And I always compare it when we get to this point in my class and I'm teaching my students. I said, this is just like you guys. When you copy each other's work and you turn it in as your own, come test time, you don't know the material. You copied John's work over there or Jane's work over there. You turned it in. I gave you credit for it because I can't prove it. But come test time, when you're on your own, you can't reproduce the material because you don't know the material. You just copied. That's what Lieutenant Jack Revel did. He didn't know Oswald. He didn't arrive at that conclusion based on his own investigation. He just copied. The ONI officer gave him the name that Robert Jones gave him, and he just copied it verbatim, wrote it at the top, and then he continued on down the list writing all the other names. It meant nothing to him. He was useful in that moment because he was producing the list that was going to be used to compile the suspect list. So all he did was copy. He was a stenographer. basically. Anyway, going back to that interaction, he's talking to Hosty, and later he goes back to his commanding officer and he reports to him what Hosty told him. And his commanding officer wants to put this in the report, and the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, overrules him and says no conversation took place in the parking garage between my guy and your guy. And my guy never said what you said he said, because it shows that the FBI had foreknowledge at the very least. And if they didn't have foreknowledge, then they were just negligent in their jobs. So I come at it from this perspective. I think the FBI had two motives. I think number one, their motive was we know now that Lee Harvey Oswald was an FBI informant. He had his own FBI informant number. So they did have foreknowledge of what was fixing to happen. We know that now. But you can't let the American people know that you had foreknowledge of an assassination attempt. So you're covering your ass, is what you're doing. And you're protecting your sources and your methods going forward. So the FBI, just like all of these other agencies that are going to participate in this cover, they have motive to cover up. Some of it has to do with sources and methods going forward. A lot of it has to do with what they knew in advance and who they were connected with. CIA had their motives to cover up. FBI had their motives to cover. And, when the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, is best friends with LBJ, another one whom I believe was a conspirator in this whole thing, he's got a personal reason to want to cover up as well. So, and we all know about the famous meeting at Clint Murchison's house the night before in Dallas. Who was there? J. Edgar Hoover was there. Nixon was there. LBJ was there. Hunt was there. I mean, so there's a lot of reasons. You asked the question, why do you believe the FBI? Do you believe all the evidence? No, because when you control the evidence, there's all kinds of examples in this case where evidence that didn't back the narrative was left out of the Warren report. And remember now, the Warren Commission got all their evidence from the FBI. So witness statements, a whole raft of evidence that was exculpatory, which at a trial would have worked towards Lee Harvey Oswald's benefit, was left out. And then evidence that was incriminating, that all made it into the record. So the FBI is in control of all that. So whatever the Warren Commission produces in the form of a Warren report is basically just whatever J. Edgar Hoover wanted them to produce. So if you don't believe the Warren report, then you can't believe in the credibility of the FBI, because the Warren Commission got all their evidence from the FBI.
Or just look at the HSCA report when they're investigating this, and they point out that Hoover considered himself an adversary of the Warren Commission.
Yeah. And that's why he put his guy
I know, that's what I wanted to get to, because
he put his guy in there, Gerald Ford, to
that.
Make sure. Yeah.
We're going to get to that because I'm going to ask you about the Warren Commission. But obviously with the FBI, there's a lot of intelligence failures there. Now, when we go into people that would be involved as what would you consider a conspirator? Doesn't necessarily have to be pulling the trigger, but much like we were mentioning with the Secret Service, anybody that really kind of covered up certain aspects of things and prevented an investigation. I asked you about eyewitnesses. I don't know if you ever got an eyewitness name down of one that you thought that was peculiar, one that you thought that was interesting. But a lot of people are examining the same event and they're coming up with drastically different accounts. Now, do you believe that FBI altered people's testimonies and statements, much like the videos of Mark Lane when he was interviewing a lot of the railroad workers and a lot of the people said, I told them this, but they never put that in there. Calvin Dodd's a good example, was never called on by the Warren Commission. S.M. Holland, James Leon Simmons, I think Ed Calloway, another one. There's a lot of people that stated something to Mark Lane, but then you look at their Warren Commission testimony or you look at their FBI interview, it's completely different and there's nothing related. Now, this is the important work of the researchers that bothered to go and do the effort the FBI should have been doing. But do you believe that a lot of the conspiratorial nature when it comes to witness testimonies, and how do you get such drastic actions or just statements from witnesses that were there at Dealey Plaza?
Well, yeah. I mean, if I believe that the FBI gave contaminated evidence or suppressed evidence or destroyed evidence with respect to what they gave to the Warren Commission, then naturally, I believe included in that was witness statements, which, people that were giving witness statements prior to the assassination saying, hey, I saw this guy, I saw Jack Ruby here, I saw this, I saw, and all this evidence disappears because they didn't want Jack Ruby with any taint of Lee Harvey Oswald or any association with the Dallas police or especially the mob, and so the Warren Commission comes out with this conclusion that Jack Ruby was just this lone nightclub owner who was distressed and operated in the heat of the moment. Why did they do that? Why did they conclude that? Because of the evidence that the FBI provided them, in spite of showgirls who said, no, I saw Oswald and Ruby together, waitresses who saw them together, people that saw them flying on the same plane together down to Cuba to get Santos Trafficani out of prison. I mean, there was all kinds of evidence of Oswald and Ruby together prior to the assassination. Marita Lorenz talks about how Ruby came to the hotel room door when she and Oswald and E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis made that trip to Dallas with all the guns in the trunk, and they brought him to a hotel room, and actually they met E. Howard Hunt there, and E. Howard Hunt paid him cash money for it. They get a knock on the door and they turn around, it's Jack Ruby. This is Marita Lorenz. None of that made it into any of the record. And Marita Lorenz is a very credible, according to a civil trial, the Hobby Lobby trial, she was one of the most credible witnesses out there. She knew what she knew, but the FBI didn't even interview her. So you're asking me, do I believe they change, witness testimony? Yeah, because they had a narrative, and just like they change physical evidence, or they, like take the gun, the fingerprints on the gun. Have you heard the name Ralph Grudy, Paul Grudy? Okay. He testifies that the FBI showed up after Oswald was dead. They've already issued several statements, including J. Edgar Hoover, that they found no fingerprints on the rifle. Nothing. And then 2 days later, after Oswald's dead, they show up at his funeral home.
Yeah.
And they tell
that's on video.
That's on video. And they, he leaves and he's got oil all over his hands, and he has to redress him and re-clean him for funeral. And meanwhile, the FBI comes out and says, hey, we found a palm print. So there's a case of manufacturing evidence after the fact.
Yeah, the FBI came and took a bunch of evidence from Dallas custody, and they returned it a day later with more evidence, which was like the whole point of them taking evidence was to eliminate duplicates or things of that sort that would be non-useful to the investigation, but they came back with even more.
Yeah, and one of the things I always point to is the use of doppelgangers. That was, you talk about, if you just assume that one of these persons was correct, this wasn't just one person that comes to the FBI and testifies. It's a whole raft of people. And they're all saying the same thing. Like, they're painting this picture of somebody being set up through these doppelgangers. And it's one thing if one person comes, it's a bunch of them. And they're given days. Like Malcolm Price says that on September 28th, a man resembling Lee Harvey Oswald came into his sports drone rifle range, and he was acting real weird, and he was trying to draw attention to himself. And he said, I even helped him adjust the scope on his rifle. And it was dark out, it was in the evening. So we used my car and the headlights on my car to light up the target. And he just remembers all this. This is just anecdotal stuff that he remembers. Why would he lie about this? And he said, Oswald came 2 more times to his range, and he always signed in as Oswald, but he couldn't swear to the fact that it was actually Oswald. And then on November 1st, a guy named Dewey Bradford tells the FBI that he was at Morgan's gun shop. And he said a man resembling Oswald couldn't swear that it was actually him when he saw the photo, but he said, boy, sure looked like him. But he came into Morgan's gun shop. He was acting rude and impertinent. He made a scene. He told the Bradford and his wife and his brother-in-law that were standing around that he'd been in the Marine Corps. I mean, just really
Well,
outlandish
it's
stuff.
like what is it? Clifford Chastain or Clinton Chastain that owns Clinton's barber shop. That saw this guy with a 14-year-old boy. Now you can say I think Oswald did travel with a boy at a time. It was one of Ruth Paine's students. She only owned one, and that guy's famous, by the way. We've all seen. Well, you probably haven't because you haven't seen Star Wars, but you've seen Indiana Jones.
No, I
Um,
haven't. I
what?
haven't.
All right. What
I've
about
never seen.
Tomb Raider?
I know. The thing of it is, that was my nickname in high school. They called me Indiana Jones. It's about the time that movie came out, and a newspaper reporter. I'm getting off track here, but a
Have you seen
newspaper.
Batman at least?
I did see Batman, and that was only because I worked at the movie theater when it came out, and I got free tickets. So
Okay.
I took a friend of mine who was a big Batman fan, but I've never seen Indiana Jones.
Well, the 14-year-old boy that Oswald was traveling with was in Batman as well too. He was an extra. I think he played one of the villains that got like beat up and arrested in the beginning. But his name is William Hootkins. He was interviewed, or his mom was interviewed on because he was only like 15 years old at the time. But that was Ruth Paine's student that started. But Clifton Chastain's statement and two other statements from barbershop employees. Mostly it comes from Clifton Chastain. Said on 3 occasions this guy walked in here with this boy who was shouting out communist views and things of that sort, and it gets attributed to Oswald. But it's the thing is that I think it might be a double if anything, because Buddy Law and I can't remember what the other guy's name was. They stated they don't recognize him as being the Oswald on TV in their
Right.
FBI reports.
That's a consistent theme, Robbie. They all say in the aftermath of the assassination, when they see the actual photo, they come forward and they tell the FBI, hey, this happened. And this guy looked just like Oswald, but I'm not completely sure. I can't swear to it that it was him. And then here's the clincher in this that's really important. I just told you about Malcolm Price and Dewey Bradford, and that happened on September 28th, November 1st. On November 2nd, we're getting closer now, Albert Guy Bogard, who was a salesman at downtown Lincoln Mercury, said a guy walked into his showroom and identified himself as Lee. So it's one thing if these guys are saying, well, he looked like Lee Oswald. This guy identified himself as Lee Oswald, and he told Bogart he didn't have any money for a down payment, but he would have a bunch of money coming in 2 or 3 weeks, and he'd pay cash for the car. And so then they went on that famous test drive, and Oswald, who never had a license, is driving 85 miles an hour down the Stemmons Freeway, scaring Bogart to death. And when he gets back to the dealership, Bogart said another salesman named Eugene Wilson came over and tries to sell Oswald the Comet, which was the car they were driving. And he asked for some credit information. When he did, Oswald got mad. He started shouting about how expensive the car was. And he says, as he's leaving, maybe I'm going to have to go back to Russia to buy a car. And then this guy claiming to be Oswald turns and leaves in a huff. Now, here's the clincher, a couple of them. The man who claimed to be Lee Oswald, later, Albert Bogart could not match him up with the real Oswald. The other one is Oswald never had a driver's license. And according to all the other witnesses, Oswald was somewhere else. The real Oswald was somewhere else that afternoon. Now, here's where it involves the FBI, because we've all heard about this famous meeting or this time when Oswald came into the FBI office and plopped a note down on James Hostie's desk. This happened.
He plopped it down in front of Nancy Lee Fenner and
Nancy Lee Fenner between November 6th and the 8th said a man got off the elevator and approached her desk and again identified himself as Mr. Oswald, and he asked to see Special Agent Hostie. And Fenner said, direct quote, Oswald, this guy claimed to be Oswald, had a, quote, wild look in his eye, and he was awfully fidgety, and he had a 3x5 envelope in his hand. And then he got hostile when he was informed that Hostie wasn't in the office. And so she said he just threw the envelope on her desk and said, well, get this to him. And he turned and he left. Fenner looks at the folded piece of paper that was sticking out the top of the envelope, and it had a handwritten message on it. And it said, quote, I will either blow up the Dallas Police Department or the FBI office. And the threat was signed, Lee Harvey Oswald. But then you go to the Texas School Book Depository, and here's the clincher for all of these sightings. The real Oswald was at work on all 3 days. And at the very same time Fenner said this happened. So if you're the FBI, And it's been, okay, don't take the word of Malcolm Price. Don't take the word of Dewey Bradford. Don't take the word of Albert Guy Bogart and Eugene Wilson. But your own secretary, Nanny Lee Fenner for James Hosty, they in your FBI building has testified that somebody identified himself as Lee Harvey Oswald. And yet we have a discrepancy because according to the Texas School Book Depository, he was at work that day.
Well,
So
also
if you're
there's
the
a
FBI,
discrepancy on
you
what the
got to
note
know
said.
something's going on. But they didn't investigate any of this.
There's a discrepancy on what the note said. Nanny Lee Fenner said it was blown up to Dallas headquarters, but after Hosty destroyed it, he said no. He was just saying he'd report us to higher
So
authority.
who do you believe there, Robbie?
I have no clue on that one. I do think it was Oswald that dropped off a note, in my opinion, but I don't think. I mean, maybe.
How could he if he's at work?
He left work.
No, you can't just leave work.
I think he might have left work.
According to the HR,
there's some statements from some witnesses at the TSPD that apparently when Oswald took his lunch, it says he went up, but in some of the statements it says they don't use the word up, they say out. So I don't know what they mean by out. Like, where do you mean he left and went out? But like I said, there's a lot of statements from people that are just weird and iffy about it. But I don't know. For me, I feel like Oswald, I don't know. It seems like not a double thing. The car thing does. But Oswald drove too. Like, a lot of people don't realize that he legally didn't have a license, but he borrowed Ruth Kane's car and would move it into the driveway and stuff like that.
He did drive it. And you know, if you go back to the New Orleans situation, remember when they went in Clinton? They were seen in Clinton, Louisiana.
Yeah.
The one time Clay Shaw was driving, they had the limo or the big black Lincoln. But the second time they went back, it was just Tim and Judith to test see if the injections had worked. He drove. He didn't have a car. He borrowed a car, but he did drive. So yeah, he did drive. I just gave you 5 names of people who saw him that there's evidence to the contrary saying they couldn't have seen the real Oswald because he was at work. 3 of those names said that whoever it was identified themselves as Lee Harvey Oswald. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, in an inner office memo, said that while Oswald was in Russia, someone was using Oswald's name to buy trucks. While Oswald's in Russia, someone down in Texas or Louisiana, I forget which, was buying trucks using Lee Harvey Oswald's name. That's FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. So the FBI knows somebody is using, according to FBI Director, he was either using his name or a social security number. So they knew it was going on.
From the time same thing with Mexico City. The photos that wasn't Oswald.
Yes. So yes, you going back to your original question. I don't believe anything. The FBI.
That's fair. I'm on that boat too.
So you say Hosty. I don't believe Hosty because he's FBI. Nanny Lee had no reason to lie. She's not involved in any of this. She doesn't know the plot. She doesn't know what the talking points are. She's just saying what happened. James Hosty has time to cleanse it, has time to think it through and say, okay, this doesn't reflect well. Of course, it's Hosty that denied talking to Jack Revel. He's already lied once. Revel said, we talked in the parking garage, and he said the FBI knew about this Oswald character and later denied it. And Revel said, well, he can deny it all he wants. I had one of my men with me. I have corroboration. So Hosty's already lied about that. So why wouldn't he lie about this? Nanny Lee, I believe her. She's just an innocent. She's just a staffer.
When you talk about informant, how do you define informant? Because when I believe he was contacted to be an informant was by the interview with John Fain the second time around, when he was curious about the activities of contacts between Marina and the Soviet Union, and he was asking Oswald, well, she said. This is when he dropped the threat on Oswald that the case was closed. You don't need to worry about this kid. He's non-threatening. That's from John Fain's. They sat in his car for 2 hours. But in his interview, he talked about that Oswald was going to feed him back information if anybody contacted Marina. And they asked him, did you pay him as an informant? And he said, we gave him some money for some information. He goes, was he an FBI informant? They asked him again. And John Fain states, well, an informant to us is just anyone that gives us information that can be beneficial to our cause. So technically he was an informant, though, if you focus on that. But obviously this goes a little bit more into like the New Orleans stuff, for instance. When Oswald gets arrested, He
Wait a
goes to,
second. Wait a second.
hold on.
Don't leave that point. That is an important point, what you brought up. You're
What?
about ready to leave it, the informant thing.
Okay.
Okay, I go back further. How did Oswald get back into the country from Russia?
He made a mess at the embassy, and the State Department decided to send him back some money.
Well, yeah, they paid for him to come back, but the only way during the Cold War a defector, a so-called defector, could return to the United States is with the permission of the Attorney General. Otherwise, especially a defector who had gone public saying he's going to turn over military secrets and try to renounce his citizenship, in that case, he would be immediately arrested and charged with treason. But nothing happened to Oswald. The Attorney General, who was the Attorney General when Oswald came back from Russia? Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was having a problem. He and Jack were having issues trying to find out what the CIA was up to. Jack is trying to make peace with Khrushchev. Okay. He's trying to keep a nuclear war from happening, but he knows the CIA is meddling around in Cuba. And Khrushchev and the Russians are not happy about it. And that threatens any peace that they're trying to back channel. So he can't get information about the CIA, what's going on inside the CIA and what they're planning, etc. So Bobby Kennedy, now, I don't have any proof of this, but this is my theory, okay? Bobby Kennedy made a deal. I'll let you back into the country, but you have to inform. I know you're in the CIA. Your job now is to be an informant for me and report back to me what's going on inside the CIA. And that, from that day forward, Lee Harvey Oswald was an informant for the FBI. Now, part of the reason I say that is because of two things. No one had more motive to want to save, well, let's put it this way. You remember the Chicago plot and how it got disrupted? An FBI informant named Lee called and said, there are snipers, there are Cuban snipers in a hotel room. They're going to shoot the president, a motorcade. And it forced the FBI to investigate and tell the Secret Service what was happening. The White House found out about it, canceled the trip. It was all destroyed by an FBI informant named Lee. Many people speculate that that was Lee Oswald. Okay. Now, fast forward to when the president is shot and Bobby Kennedy gets news of it. He's back at Rose Hill, which is his house or his home back in Washington, Virginia, actually. And FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover calls him on the phone. Your brother's been shot. I'll let you know what happens. He hung up. Calls back a little bit later. Your brother's dead. Just like that. That was how it was communicated. And Bobby immediately suspected three entities. All you have to do is follow Bobby and his actions in the moments after. He suspected the CIA, he suspected the Cubans, and he suspected the mob. All right. And when J. Edgar Hoover called him later and said, we have a suspect in custody, his name is Lee Harvey Oswald, Bobby just ignored it. You would think a family member at that point, if he trusted Hoover and he didn't know anything about who this Oswald character was, he would hop all over that information. He's the attorney freaking general. He ignored it. In fact, the next thing he does is he sends his own people out to start asking around in Chicago and Miami about the mob and their involvement. He sends people down to the Cubans to find out about that. And he's confronting the CIA director. He absolutely pays this information about Lee Harvey Oswald no mind at all. Because he knows Lee Harvey Oswald, and he knows him from that time when he gave him permission to come back to the United States and become an FBI informant from him, and he knows he's in the CIA. In fact, that information that FBI director gave him, that Lee Harvey Oswald was the suspect, actually clued Oswald into the fact that the CIA was behind it, because he knew who Oswald worked for. So I didn't want you to fly by that point too quickly, because I honestly think that he became an FBI informant when he came back from Russia. That's the only way he can get back into the country without any recriminations whatsoever. Somebody, the attorney general has to sign off on that. And the attorney general was Bobby Kennedy.
The Kennedy family isn't much at fault in the cover up as much as it is the others as well too. They've been very secret, and I get it because they lost a family member. But Bobby never testified to the Warren Commission. He should have, and he never publicly expressed his doubts on the Warren Commission's findings. He supported its conclusions, which I get you have to do, I guess, if you're in political office. But it gets to the informant thing I want to ask about. When Oswald was arrested, he went to when he asked for an FBI agent to come down and see him. I have not been able to see if an FBI agent actually visited him, but the HSCA found an answer to that. The HSCA found out that there was Oswald's uncle, Charles Dutz Moret, who was mobbed up with Carlos Marcello or had gambling operations that were in line with Carlos Marcello. Now, this was investigated about Oswald's background, the mafia connection type deal. But the person, oh God, I think it's Sam Termine. Sam Termine, his name is. Oh no, it's in Charles Dutz Moret's. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Charles Dutz Moret's testimony, or not testimony, statements. If you read it, he talks about that he used to pick up and, Oswald, he's like the father figure of Oswald's life. Well, when he returns back to New Orleans, he finds out Oswald got arrested for handing out leaflets and getting into an altercation. His daughter informs him that a mutual friend, who has close ties to Carlos Marcello, went and called in a favor and got Oswald out of jail. It wasn't an FBI agent. It was a close friend with someone who was associated with Carlos Marcello. And then that's when Charles Dutz Moret said, you need to go out before your court hearing, before your appearance, you need to make a public statement. You need to make like an interview or do something like that. And that's, I don't know. Like I said, that's the HSCA's work. But then Sam Termine, I think his name's Termine or Termine. There is hold on, let me just make sure I get this correctly because it is pretty interesting. It was a lawyer who had mob associations with Carlos Marcello at the time, because anything that involves New Orleans basically tied in with Carlos Marcello. But Marguerite Oswald went to him and asked him if he would help falsify Lee Harvey Oswald's birth certificate so he can get into the Marine Corps. And originally he said no, he wouldn't do it. Then he admitted to doing it and falsifying papers, but told her he's not going to get in with this. Like anybody that looks at this for longer than a minute, it's just going to get rejected. It did get rejected, and then a year later when he was of age, he joined. But later he was called to go, when Oswald was arrested in Dallas, he was called to go represent Oswald, and he said he wouldn't do it. And there was no other information on that. He never spoke about it. So, I think the guy's name is, there's Dutz Moret, and then, it's Clem Sert. Clem Sert. Clemsehrt. So there's a lot more that I learned about the HSCA when it comes to mob connections on stuff. And I get that, like, I don't think necessarily the mob's behind it, but there's a lot of things about Oswald's background that a lot of people aren't aware of, and a lot of stuff that brings more weight into the argument that he wasn't just a lone nobody.
Oh my goodness. He floated in so many worlds. His New Orleans connections to Marcello go back when he was a boy. He ran errands. He was an errand boy. If you put any stock in what Judith Very said, Carlos Marcello was sort of like their, he supported them financially a lot of that summer of '63 and comped a lot of their meals at the 500 Club, comped a lot of their hotel room stays in their last few days together. Also provided a call wheel for Oswald to use and to call from Dallas when he got reassigned to Dallas, to call to Bradenton, Florida, where Judith Very had ended up, so that they could call and talk to each other for hours on end without any charge. It was the same call that they used to communicate the booking of the for the horse racing, all the bets and stuff. So Marcello was very intricately involved with Oswald, and think about David Ferry. Oswald and Ferry are like this, and Ferry worked for Marcello. He was an investigator trying to help him in his struggles to stay in the United States. When
his office was 2 doors down from Jim Braden, that guy gets brought up, who was at the JFK and RFK assassination.
And he was in Chicago.
Just a coincidence.
He was in Chicago in fact, he was arrested in Chicago. He was arrested in Chicago with David Morales, a CIA assassin. Those were the two that were of the Cubans that were arrested. The others got away. They let him go. And then the next place that they're seen is in Dallas.
They call him Sanchez.
Sanchez, yeah.
David Sanchez Morales.
or the big Texan. He was a big guy. But anyway, the mob connections are deep with Oswald, up to and including his own uncle, who was like a soldier in Marcello's family, crime family. So yeah, and to say that. So I was talking about how he floats back and forth. He was recruited into the CIA when he was in the Marine Corps. And when you see him in New Orleans, he's working with Guy Bannister, who is basically the CIA bagman in New Orleans, collecting money and materials and weapons, whatever, for Operation Mongoose. Also with David Ferry, worked with the CIA. Also with Clay Shaw, who we found out years later was the CIA's man in New Orleans. And here's Oswald working with him. So he's floating in the CIA. Then we find out he's an FBI informant. So he's floating with the FBI. If you listen to Richard Case Nagel, he was also had infiltrated Alpha 66 and the Cubans. And so you got this Oswald character who the government wants us to believe is this lone nut, this ne'er-do-well 24-year-old flunky who didn't graduate from high school, but somehow performed really well during the military Russian language training institute, the hardest language to learn as an adult. He did really well. And here he is floating amongst the FBI, the CIA, the Cubans, the mob, all of these different entities. He's sort of he's everywhere. Marino Loren sees him in Miami. They have training film of him at Lake Pontchartrain at the northern training sites. He's in the Newman building. He's running Fair Play for Cuba committee. One day his signature appears in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, goes to the nuclear lab to visit. I mean, the guy is everywhere. He's like Waldo. He's everywhere. And he's in this amorphous blob that one day is interacting with the CIA, working with them. The next day he's working with the mob. And Dr. Ochsner in some medical project. This guy is not what the government wanted us to believe he was. He's just too connected.
I want to get to the Warren Commission because we're about an hour and a half into this thing. I want to get into the Warren Commission. When we say conspirators, like I mentioned before, people that are part of the cover-up, every single member on the Warren Commission eventually had private doubts or expressed their doubts privately on the commission's findings. There are a few that stated them publicly, but still you could consider them part of the cover-up because they still signed their name to it and went along with it anyway. But I want to get your thoughts on the member of the Warren Commission, the ones that you are more in belief that had some type of involvement in covering things up. For instance, I believe Earl Warren should have never been in charge of that panel. Mostly because he was way too close to it. He did a private interview with Jackie and denied others to be able to speak with Jackie because he believed that she already been through too much, which you could say, oh, it's a good thing of him to do. Not really when you're trying to do an investigation. Deny people seeing the autopsy photographs because he believed that it was just too graphic for them to be able to see. So obviously there's a big issue with being too personally connected to the Kennedy family to be in charge of that commission. Obviously, you mentioned Gerald Ford earlier.
Well, Earl Warren was a stooge. The only reason he was on the commission was for his name. LBJ needed him. They needed it for the name. They needed it to call the Warren Commission. Really, the guy who was running it was Allen Dulles. You couldn't call it the Dulles Commission. Nobody would believe it. So he was on the commission, but the guy who really ran it was Allen Dulles. And of course, in association with that was Gerald Ford, who was the FBI's. So you think about who put this together. First of all, you have to start with who put this together. And it was LBJ. And without getting into all the facts about LBJ and his involvement, I believe wholeheartedly he was involved in the plot. Okay? It doesn't work. You don't get the immunity that you need afterwards unless the next president is on your side. So the only way this works is LBJ is involved in the plot. So you start there. He put the commission together. There's not anything the commission's going to come up with. And his best friend is J. Edgar Hoover. We've already established that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI was complicit in covering up all kinds of stuff and producing this government narrative. So you got LBJ, who is a conspirator in the assassination itself, who puts it together. And the way it's arranged is his best friend, J. Edgar Hoover, is going to supply the Warren Commission all the evidence. And then all that evidence is going to go to Alan Dulles and Gerald Ford. And all these other commissioners are just bit players. They fill their role, but really Alan Dulles is running the show. And anything that is happening there, Gerald Ford is reporting back to J. Edgar Hoover. So it's rigged. The whole thing is rigged. You can't believe a damn thing they say. None of it's true. It's all rigged. And that's why you come up with these fantastic theories like the single bullet theory, because they had to make all the evidence fit. And it's preposterous on its face. But like Alan Dulles said, we can reproduce whatever we want in this report. No one's going to read it. He didn't count on all these independent researchers. Just give you this one scenario. You've heard of Jolly West, right? All right. Alan Dulles maneuvered this whole situation. The biggest interview is going to be Jack Ruby. He's the only witness still alive that can tell him anything about what happened in Dallas. So he waits until Jolly West has had his meeting with Jack Ruby down in a Dallas jail. And during that time, Ruby apparently had some psychotic break with reality. He was let alone in a room, a cell without any video equipment, without any other people present, with Jolly West, who is this MK Ultra doctor. And he had been apparently fine until West meets with them. West emerges from that meeting and says, during the course of that meeting, Jack Ruby had a psychotic break and it's irreparable. That's when Alan Dulles and the Warren Commission chose to go down and interview Jack Ruby. They waited. They didn't interview Jack Ruby before he'd met with Jolly West. They waited until Jolly West did his deed. And then when he was very publicly deemed a psychotic mess, they go down and interview him and they say his testimony is worthless. That was all arranged. That has all the earmarks of intelligence training. You have the appearance of searching for the truth. Yes, we interviewed Jack Ruby. We went down to Dallas. We interviewed him, but his testimony was a bunch of gibberish. Yeah, you waited to interview him until after Jolly West met with him and injected him with God knows what, and he became a blithering idiot for a period of time. That's when you went down. Only one person can arrange that. That's Alan Dulles. Earl Warren doesn't know anything about any of that. He's just following Alan Dulles' lead. That is one little piece of the puzzle where they're afraid what Jack Ruby might say. And so to discredit anything he might say, you set in this sequential order, this order of events. You have your own doctor from your own program that you're aware of. Alan Dulles is the one that signed off on MK Ultra. No one knows more about MK Ultra than Alan Dulles and the effects it has on the human brain. They've been working on it for years. So he assigns his doctor to go to Dallas, meet with Ruby. No one's there. No one knows what happened in that cell or in that interview room. All we know is what happened afterwards, and Ruby emerges a blithering idiot. And then I can just imagine a scenario where Jolly West gets on the phone, calls his buddy Alan. He says, it's done. And Alan Dulles announces to the Warren Commission, next week we're going to Dallas. We're going to interview Jack Ruby. Now, when you consider that scenario and how all that happened, is it that big? Is that much of a stretch to believe that they worked in those sorts of ways, or Alan Dulles worked in those sorts of ways to rig all the other interviews or to rig all the other evidence like they did the single bullet theory? Why? It was always about a lone gunman. It was always about the patsy. It was always about blaming everything on Oswald. And anybody who might, could, potentially would say to the otherwise, their evidence got distorted, it got changed, it got left out, it got destroyed, it got suppressed. So no, I don't believe anything that came from the FBI. I don't believe anything that came from the Warren Commission. I certainly don't believe anything that came from the CIA, who lied and lied and lied and lied. No, we have no connection to Lee Harvey Oswald. No, we don't know who George Joannides is. We don't know his role. He had no role with respect to Lee Harvey Oswald during the time of the assassination. And we find out later everything the CIA ever told us was lies. I don't believe anything, any of this. This is why I go back to what I started off today. This is why none of this is in a standard to teach high school students, because it all points back to government malfeasance. And to keep that narrative that this was a singular individual who acted as a lone gunman on his own, you just don't want people looking at it too close. So we have high school students who are completely ignorant. There's one little paragraph in every U.S. history textbook I've ever used in 26 years of teaching about the JFK assassination. You know what it says? On November 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated by a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, hiding in the Texas School Book Depository building. Bingo, that's it. And then they move on to the next topic. Because you look too close, it's too easy, it's too apparent. We've learned too much in 61 years that this points back at the government. And to keep people's faith in this government, and they got away with it. They had their guy in charge, who's now the president. Their guy is running the FBI. Their guy is running the Warren Commission, Alan Dulles. They have their hands on the controls of all the levers of power. And so they completely got away with it. They had their guy, Dan Rather, run around telling everybody, I saw the Zapruder film. His head rocked forward with considerable force. And that was an abject lie. So they got the media under control. We already know about Operation Mockingbird, who they got, the CIA has all of the media under their thumb, including Rather. So they got the media, they got the intelligence community, they got the government, the FBI, all the levers of power. And they sold this narrative. And then 9 months or 10 months after the assassination, they produced the Warren Report, which becomes the official story. And that's what puts in all the libraries and gets, it makes all the headlines. Books are written about it. Textbooks are written from it. And for 61 years, we've been reproducing a lie. That these characters that we've been talking about that distorted everything, they were involved in the planning and the lead up. They had a cover story all prepared to drop when they needed it. And any little incidentals that might rise up and be a little bit of a complicating factor, they just got rid of. And not just by destroying evidence or suppressing it. In some cases, they killed people. I mean, I know you don't put a lot of stock in Jim Garrison, but Jim Garrison was the first guy to go up against this monolithic giant. And he paid a huge price for it. And his witnesses, who were going to testify in court under oath that the CIA was behind all this, all died. David Ferry died. Eladio Del Valle died. Jim Garrison himself was smeared.
Well, yeah, they had NBC. There's a couple memos I've already done articles about, but or clips about. The quote of Garrison's making an investigation into the assassination. He's going to launch a special about it, and then they just go, "We're going to make our special, and then we're going to quote shoot him down." So they obviously were going to counter whatever Garrison had. I just don't think you need him to necessarily understand the case. I think you just have to look at like the basic things that we've learned from the Warren Commission.
You don't, but you know what? It is an anecdotal piece. And you brought up Abraham Bolden earlier. We don't know about Abraham Bolden if it's not for Jim Garrison and Mark Lane. Jim Garrison and Mark Lane were working together on the case down in New Orleans. When they found out about Abraham Bolden, they said, well, what happened to that guy? Oh, he's rotting away in a mental hospital up in Missouri. They went up to Missouri and held a press conference. And they told the American people, this is what happened to this man. He was a whistleblower. He told the truth about the Secret Service, and they railroaded his ass. And he's sitting in there right now. They're trying to break his brain. And the American people put so much pressure on the government as a result of that press conference, Abraham Bolden got released early. That's why we know about Abraham Bolden, because the courage of Jim Garrison and Mark Lane. They weren't even investigating that part of it. That wasn't even part of the story. They happened upon it. And they decided, this is something that we can do. We can go up there and draw attention to this story because the Secret Service has buried it. That's why we know about Abraham Bolden, because of Jim Garrison and Mark Lane. These are heroes. And yes, were they perfect? No. But they stood up against the machine. The machine kicked into gear before the assassination, accomplished what they wanted, their objective, and then had all the levers of power afterwards to ram the narrative down the American people's throat. And at the same time, simultaneous, get rid of anybody who might be a complicating factor, up to and including killing them if necessary. They tried to kill Abraham Bolden. They shot at his wife. They tried to blow up his garage, his house, cars. It's unbelievable. You know, have you ever heard of Michael Franzese? He's on YouTube. He's a former mobster that got out of the mob, and now he does a YouTube channel. He was in the Colombo crime family, and he was alive during all this era. He just wrote a book called Mafia Democracy. I would encourage you to read that, because Mafia Democracy, he learned at the feet of his dad, who was he was like a number two in the Colombo crime family. And Michael himself rose to become like a capo regime in the Colombo crime family. And he said, I thought we were crooks. I was trained in the art of organized crime. I thought we were crooks. We don't hold a candle to the U.S. government. The lengths to which they'll go. And he documents a lot. It's just amazing. It's an amazing story. So once you come from that paradigm and you realize that the government is just a criminal enterprise, just like any of these other it's organized, it's extremely organized, then nothing is beyond the pale. Your mind opens. It's like when I was a kid, I could not believe that the Secret Service would intentionally strip security and leave the president vulnerable to an assassination. I just didn't believe it. I gave him too much credit. And let me tell you, what happened in 1963 informs a lot of what I believe what happened in 2024 in Butler, Pennsylvania. It's the same scenario.
All right, let's not. There's a lot of people that listen to these JFK episodes that are either hardcore Trump fans or anti-Trump.
I'm not a Trump fan. I'm just saying.
I know. But the name just triggers people. It's that
I didn't even use the name. You did.
Oh, that's true. I'll have to edit that out. But Barry, no, I seriously always appreciate all the chats that we do. If I end up doing the occasional episode, you're always welcome back on here. But I want to give you a chance to be able to promote what your new venture is. Obviously, History Plus, and any other links where they can find it, what you're offering for people, and I'll make sure to link it in the description.
Well, I appreciate it, Robbie. It's called Standards Plus History Academy. I've sent Robbie the link, so I'm assuming you'll put it in the notes or the description. It's a website. It offers you two different options. If you're homeschooling your kid, you can get the curriculum for U.S. history, world history, or government. Also, if you want an elective offering, the JFK assassination, that's there as well. You can just buy the curriculum and teach it yourself, or you can hire me as an online teacher. There's two options. And so there's that. And there's also a Patreon channel where I do a daily YouTube, and it's on Rumble, it's on Spotify. And I'm putting all those on Patreon for the same reasons Robbie's just discussing. There's some things you just can't put on YouTube. So I'm putting it on Patreon, and you can subscribe to that as well. And I keep up with that. I've got 150 some odd episodes so far and counting. So one of two ways. You can go to my website, www.sphistory.com, or you can go to my Patreon channel, which is also under Standards Plus History Academy.
And I'll make sure I link all those in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, Barry. And thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.